You're listening to Catholic Family Podcast.
I'm Kevin Davis. Thanks so much for listening to the show. I'm happy to be joined today by Matt.roch.arthur. And I have to mention here at the beginning that we pre-recorded this show. And upon listening to it again and doing a little bit of editing, we decided there are a few things that we missed. First of all, I missed actually introducing Matthew and telling us about who he is and exactly why he wanted to do a show about music and why we wanted to do a show about music. And so he's going to introduce that a little bit and tell us about himself and about why he wants to do that. And I think he also has a few notes that he wants to mention before we get into this show. This is actually going to be a 3-part show, and this is part 1 of said show. So Matthew, thanks for joining, and please take it away.
Thanks very much, Kevin, and thanks for having me to even just record this intro or prologue, as you will. A bit about myself. So I'm a husband and father of 2 daughters. Regarding music, I play piano, guitar, and I try to play violin sometimes, but fail miserably. I've been writing my own music just for fun since I was 13 or so. Got into music production as well. I want to make it very clear to listeners that I am not qualified in music. The only thing I can say is that I recently completed a video course on Udemy. That's a website where you can pay for courses. And this was by an instructor who did have a PhD in music, and he claims that the video course does cover all the material that will be covered in a music university course. I think he actually is a professor. Even doing this, as awesome as it was, it's clearly not the same as going through the process of completing a proper music course. They do assignments, they do exams. And just as an example as well, I believe I remember the instructor saying that students would analyze a piece of music every week at university, whether that was throughout the whole degree or just some of the semesters, I can't remember. I only did a few analyses. So very big interest in music, but not qualified. So I want to call that out as well. Why am I interested in doing this show? Well, for starters, I've always loved music. It's always been a big part of my life. My dad started teaching me piano when I was younger. My siblings love music. We get together and we'll play folk songs. It's just a big part of our lives. Also in the choir as well. I did my first presentation. That's not the word I'm looking for, but last Christmas, sang with midnight mass with the choir was the first time, which was pretty exciting. But my sisters do most of that. They sing in the choir and my dad plays the organ mainly. One thing as well, so to get more off myself, but kind of more the interest in this particular show, after I found out that my wife was pregnant with our first child, you start to think about things a bit more deeply when you've got a kid on the way. And one of those things for me was music. And some of the things I would think of is, well, what if, clerics, older Catholics, people say things about modern music, and what if they are right? And let's even drill down there, but what if, for instance, if the music I listen to can affect me as a person, and that can affect me negatively if I'm not listening to the right music, then I clearly need to step up if I'm going to be a dad. And we all know that example speaks louder than words. So if I come to a logical conclusion that my children should listen to certain music and shouldn't listen to other music, then I would clearly need to lead by example. As for doing this show as well, I have 2 motivations. Now, the first motivation is a bit lighthearted, and it's really just I love talking and nerding about music. So this was a lot of fun to record. A bit more on the serious side. I think music is something that many traditional Catholics do not understand nor prioritize making decisions about in their lives. I think that many Catholics know that bad visuals are clearly wrong. It's not too hard to come to those conclusions. But if something's quote unquote just music or quote unquote just sound, I find that Catholics tend to underestimate it. I think many Catholics also do not understand all the complexities with music, even though it's not overly complex, but sound is harder to analyze than things people can usually visualize. You can see a piece of art. People are used to using their eyes to analyze things, or even abstract concepts. You can think about abstract concepts. But sound is something that not many people are trained in or have that skill naturally, or it's not something that people kind of, work out that sound muscle, so to speak. It's just not one of those things. But with that, music is such a big part in most people's lives, I would say. And the music that is chosen to be listened to should be chosen with reasoning, and it should be chosen deliberately. I hope that this show provides valuable information that people can use when assessing whether to listen to certain music or not.
Perfect. Matthew, thank you for that introduction and for that prologue and learning a little bit about you. And I guess with that, let's get into the show.
Thanks, Kevin. Actually, can I mention one more thing?
Of course, do it. No worries.
Cheers. One thing I'd like to add as well at the beginning of the show, and this is just me thinking about this after recording, is I want to just point out a few things that I think listeners will benefit from knowing, just to help listeners get into the mindset of this show. Now, Kevin and I are going to be very critical at times with musical pieces, and some of these musical pieces are totally fine to listen to in and of themselves. In fact, they are much better than most music that people listen to today. But we are going with this show to conduct critical analysis with also perspective of hindsight to help listeners understand how we got to where we are today, and also to identify certain elements in music, what is good, what is not so good, and what is even bad. I think we need to be transparent here, Kevin, and I want to let listeners know the main purpose of this show is to demonstrate to listeners why most modern music should be rejected, and trying to substantiate this with analysis of the music itself, as well as providing the historical context of music. The purpose of this show is also to help listeners figure out what to do about the fact that modern music should be rejected. Rejecting it, of course, is obvious, but what else? What music should we listen to if modern music should not be listened to by Catholics? What should we consider when choosing to listen to music, and why? And I think the key word here is why. This show is to help listeners identify the why behind the decisions that should be made by Catholics regarding music. I encourage the listeners to listen to all 3 shows. Only listening to 1 or 2 of these shows will leave the listener with an incomplete understanding, as this mini-series really is designed to be listened to as a whole, and everything ties together to give the listeners the full picture. I hope that this series provides your listeners, Kevin, with useful information to help them make the right decisions with music they listen to.
Perfect. All right, then let's roll.
Thanks, man.
Episode 16.
And so, yeah, I guess, we've had some time to prep for this. And before we really get started, I want to say that neither of us is a moral authority. We're not moral theologians. We're not even music experts. I'm just a guy with a microphone who spent very little time studying this whatsoever. Matthew spent a lot more time in putting together this show and doing a lot of effort and research into this topic, but he is also not a quote unquote expert in this issue. So we're just a couple of guys talking about the issue, which we hope is interesting. We hope that someone can learn a little bit about music and how it has gone from, again, being godly until it is now very ungodly. And so, Matthew, I think we should probably start then basically discussing the morality or the basic immorality of music. What do we know about that?
Yeah, good question, Kevin. So, like you said, we're not theologians, but when I was preparing for this show, I did speak to a priest or some priest for advice, and I'm just going to read out an excerpt from a moral theology book, and this excerpt was pointed out to me. So I'll go into that quickly and then just a bit of a paraphrasing just to sort of set the scene. So here we go. Music, as art and a medium of general entertainment, is in itself morally indifferent. Its moral character depends on its purpose or use. By its nature, music exercises a wonderful influence on human sentiment. For this reason, as in ancient Jewish worship, the Church makes wide use of music in her liturgy. Music may serve evil purposes as a medium of attracting large crowds to places of entertainment where the sensual nature is stimulated and passions aroused. This type of music gives rise to a moral problem of cooperation in illicit actions. As formal cooperation in the sins of others, such music is never permissible. As material cooperation in the sins of others, that is, in a performance not intended to induce evil actions, it may be illicit under certain circumstances, for proportionately grave reasons, and provided that all scandal is removed. Now, that's obviously from a moral theology textbook, so it's quite sort of detailed, so I'll just do a quick paraphrasing. So I've just done some bullet points here. Music, and this is my paraphrasing, music as entertainment is in and of itself indifferent. Music designed to stimulate evil passions and elicit actions is evil. Catholics should not listen to nor attend performances designed for evil. Catholics can listen to music and attend performances that are not intended to induce evil actions, provided there is no scandal. A note on this last point, this is permissible, not encouraged. Thus, we're looking at a concession here. Again, or not even again, but I should say, for any more information on that, for further clarification on that, please speak to a priest, a trusted priest, for advice.
Yeah, exactly, because they will know better about what is actually allowed and what's not, because it is a little bit of a gray area, because what is actually sinful and what isn't. Actually, I've heard different opinions even from different priests. It's a little bit of a hard thing to define, but some of it I think is very obvious. I mean, some of it, which is, again, we're going to talk about in detail today, about how it becomes too emotional, how it can, enrage us to anger or different passions. And of course, very obviously, if it has illicit lyrics, lyrics that are sinful or bad or lead us into an occasion of sin, which unfortunately, as we both know, is hugely common in today's music of any sort. This is not just rap. This is not just rock. This is really all areas of music that has lyrics. Most of them at some point are illicit and are impure and bad and sinful. And we'll talk about that a little more in episode 2. We're going to have 2 episodes. I think we're going to have quite the show today. I'm really excited for both of them. We'll get a little more into modern music in episode 2 of this show about music. But I think we want to start back in the 9th century. We're going to talk a little bit about music that goes way back to Gregorian chant and kind of define the height of music. Now, as Matthew says in the show notes, there was obviously music before the 9th century. There was obviously music in China, in Africa, and South America. These are things that we're obviously not going to cover in today's show, because you could talk about it for years and years and years and have to do a lot of study. We're going to talk about Western civilization and its music starting in the 9th century. So Matthew, where do you want to begin?
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. So I'll just do a quick caveat here. Now, the findings that I'm going to mention are based on shallow research, even sometimes Wikipedia, and the foreign languages have sometimes made it difficult to verify all details. And this is especially true for this particular era, as you said, starting in the 9th century, the 9th to the 12th century approximately. However, hopefully the findings give an overall accurate picture. So we'll start off with it. So back in the medieval era, music was primarily sacred. And we're looking at Gregorian chant here. Gregorian chants mainly from this era. Composers that are not recorded on a CD, but recorded in history, in the 9th to 10th centuries, were all religious, mostly monks. As we get into the 11th century, secular composers from history that were recorded there, including some composers, they wrote immoral lyrics as well. So it's kind of it goes to show how human nature always tends to some corruption. But overall, the music itself, especially the sacred stuff, was very, very good. I would say that just based on my own observations, and obviously acknowledging that there are many different pieces of music from these eras, but the effects of the music from this era that have on people, that is the effects that people might have from listening to it, the emotional effect, if you will, the mental effect or physical effect, I would say mainly are peacefulness, stability, and does not affect emotions, or if so, very minimally.
And so when you say, first, I got to go back a little bit. When you say from the 9th to 10th centuries, it was mostly religious, is that because they were the only ones writing music, or they were the only ones actually recording much of anything back in the 9th and 10th centuries? I think that's an interesting point that I get a little historical here, because it drives me crazy when historians, quote unquote, call this period the Dark Ages. And I guess there is some reason I can kind of understand, because the Roman civilization fell and then it kind of built up from there. But from the 9th to 10th centuries, really, the Catholic Church was the only thing holding together civilization. And it was actually a fairly beautiful society. And I think that's something that people really need to understand, that this was not this time that modern day historians painted as being almost dark. Like you watch a movie that was based in the 9th to 10th centuries, and it's always based in this dark scale of light to make it seem like these were almost evil times. And I think it's fairly ridiculous.
Yeah, absolutely. And even with the question of why are they all religious that are recorded in history at this time? It's a good question that I don't have the answers to. It could potentially be the fact that maybe the church, like you said, they were the only ones actually recording this music because the era was so heavily Catholic. I think it would be unreasonable to assume that people who weren't religious were not making music, but it would sort of show the mentality of the time, that the music that was recorded was by religious people. But that's all speculation, really. We can only sort of look at what we do have.
Well, and look at how many saints came from this era too. There are many, many saints from all over the world, really. And I think that you see the growth and the beauty of the Catholic Church in this era. And I think as we people today, we really think that our society is the best, and that we have progressed and modernized things to the highest point they could be achieved. And then you actually go back and you look, and it was a much better time in terms of actually offering things to God, as in the music, which again, I think we're going to give a couple examples here of the simplicity of the music, but the simple beauty of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And the beauty, I think, is very, very clear in these samples. So I guess we'll get on to the first sample of music. I'm going to butcher the pronunciations, probably not just of the names of the pieces. I'm not going to read the pieces in full, but even the names of the composers throughout the show. So hopefully listeners get a bit of enjoyment out of that. But let's get into the first one and have a listen to Victimae Paschali. So when I listen to that excerpt, I think of it's very stable, it's very peaceful, and I would also use the term uplifting. What would you say about that one, Kevin?
Yeah, it's actually one that I know quite well. I've sung that in choir. I believe that's it's a hymn we sing for Easter, and it's one I've always enjoyed singing because it has this very nice flow. And I think Gregorian chant, I think people often take it as this old-fashioned, kind of hard to listen to, type of music. But I think it's really not true, especially if you really sit down and try to enjoy it, and especially if you sing it. I think you really get to appreciate the flow, and not even just the flow, the mathematics of it. I think maybe that's something you can speak to, that the music of this era is very mathematical. Gregorian chant is very, if you've ever sung it, or especially if you've ever written it. I haven't written it, but I have two brothers who've written some music, and it's very timed, I guess. That there's a very good logic to it.
Yeah, absolutely. It does use some system. I'm not overly familiar with the Gregorian chant style of music or system of music as classical. However, one thing I do believe is used is a thing called modes. And to be really simple here, you know how you have scales in music, like a major and a minor scale?
Right.
They're actually the same thing as two modes, but there's, I think, 6 other modes. So think of all these different types of scales out there. Major and minor are mainly used today. I would say they're actually the most pleasant to listen to. There's a reason I think that they became the most popular. But my understanding of Gregorian chant is that they would actually use that particular system and they would stay within that, I believe. However, as for all the technicalities, I couldn't comment too much. But yeah, it's very nice music. And I think one thing to mention as well is that you said try to get into it, try to listen to it. And we'll probably touch on this more in the second episode. However, the modern mentality of music is listening to music for a different purpose. And we might get into that a bit later. Like Gregorian chant and this sacred music, it seems to me when I'm listening to that it's designed to help people think of God. Maybe if you're in mass or in a ceremony, to help you take in what's going on, to raise your minds to God. That's sort of what I think when I hear that kind of music.
Absolutely. You feel like you should be hearing it or singing it in a huge cathedral, right? And it's the same as with the aesthetics of a cathedral, that why they built it so high and so up that your eyes are naturally lifted up towards God. It's the same with the music. It is naturally uplifts you and makes you come closer to God, and you see the godliness of this music, or you hear the godliness of this music, I should say. So I guess what's number 2?
Yeah, let's listen to Agnus Dei, which is a Gregorian chant, I believe.
Agnus Dei, qui tollis peccata multi, miserere nobis.
Again, I'm hearing their peacefulness and stability. What are you hearing, Kevin?
Yeah, again, I guess I think of it as being something sung by monks. I guess that's kind of what culture tells me it should be. But I think there's something intrinsically holy about it. I really do. I really think that Gregorian chant, at least the best of it, is actually in some way inspired by God or the Holy Ghost. I don't think there's any proof of that. I'm not saying it's necessarily some sort of for sure divine inspiration, but to me, when I hear it, it sounds godly. It sounds like it comes directly from God. And I think that the people who wrote it, I imagine to have been very holy people, at least many of these tracks that you can hear with Gregorian chant.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also that if people are in a good upbringing, good society, that's going to shape people. And the way people are shaped affects their art. So if you have an era, or people who are religious, just because someone's religious, of course, does not mean they're holy or a saint. But if you think of that time as a general rule, it seems to be that it's so focused on Catholicity, on God, that it makes sense that it's going to sound more godly than music that's written in a society that isn't as focused on that.
Right. As you say, it was written for God. It was not written for the people's entertainment. And I think you see that. I mean, look at architecture these days too. I think as you see the how it goes downwards in music in form of beauty. I think it's the same in terms of architecture. That look at the architecture now or in the 1950s. It's absolutely horrific. And they did it because it was easy or cheap or whatever. And back in the day, they spent a lot of time to build these cathedrals and churches and monasteries because it was for God, and they knew that this mattered and that it would last. And they had this idea of eternity on their minds. And when I think you have the idea of eternity, you build more eternal things. Obviously, these churches aren't eternal, but they are more leaning that way than these block structures that you see down the street.
Oh, absolutely. I don't even know what else to say to that. It's just so correct. Some of the modern art these days is just uninspiring, to say the least.
Right. And there is something as intrinsic beauty. There is beauty, and there is something that is actually ugly. Now, society tries to tell us that that's not the case, and that, one thing is it's all in the eye of the beholder. Now, maybe for some things that's the case, with people, someone finds a different person attractive, but not in terms of art. There is actual beauty, and there is actual non-beauty, something that is against beauty. And I think we see that in music, architecture, and art. I mean, consistently. And I think it's really interesting to start again with these Gregorian chants that are, in my opinion, intrinsically beautiful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess if you are talking about objective beauty, there are going to be times with music where someone's going to find a piece of music much nicer than someone else's. So there is a degree of subjectivity as to how much one enjoys something. But if we're going to look at something objective, I would argue that the music that's more designed to give glory to God is going to be the objectively more beautiful music. I think that's where the objective measure is. How does it relate to God?
Right. And I think also with even just the form of almost the mathematics of it, how does it add onto itself? I mean, it's the same with architecture. I mean, architecture is beautiful because it is formed in a mathematically pleasing way. We can see that this is, and usually it's mathematically formed in the way that God also forms, trees or anything else. There is a beauty, and I think it's the same with music. Now, as you say, people can take enjoyment from different things, but I think that objectively, this sort of music is more beautiful than even some of the stuff that's going to come up in the next centuries. But anyway, let's keep moving on. What's the next one of this?
I agree. The next one, the next excerpt is by Saint Hildegard von Bingen. Let's have a listen.
Yeah, I think that again, it's similar to the others, that it's very pure. It's very uplifting in bringing your mind towards God. I think if anyone heard that, even anyone on the street, if you play that in a shopping mall, their instinct, they're going to know that this is an otherworldly sound. This is not a sound of men. This is a sound of God. And I think that's immediately what comes to me, that this is not of this world.
Absolutely. And I don't know if it was just when I listened to it then, and maybe I'm reading too much into this, but when I listened to it just then, I just thought of, this sounds like someone dying in peace, just dying like, I think I'm going to heaven, which is funny because the saints never did that. They always had fear of the Lord, but that's what it sounded like to me.
Right. Total. Well, and you have this almost, because I think it's almost angelic. It's almost dreamy, but not in a negative way. And I have to mention too about Saint Hildegard, because this is kind of a funny story, that she is a German saint who is very, I wouldn't say popular here, but among Catholics, well known for her dietary writings. Like, she wrote a lot about science and about diet and what plants are good to eat and all these different things. So my diet these days is shaped very much from Saint Hildegard von Bingen, who wrote back, 1,000 years ago, which I also give my wife a very hard time, that we're a little behind the times in terms of diet. But anyway, we were cooking the other day, and we're cooking Brussels sprouts and vegetables and dark rice. And I was listening to some of this music written by Saint Hildegard, and I told my wife, it was just like, boy, I think soon enough our entire lives are going to be formed by Saint Hildegard. So as we see, something from 1,000 years ago, this amazing woman, this amazing saint, is still having an impact in my life today. And I think that's pretty incredible, not just spiritually, but also actually physically. So good on you, amazing. Saint Hildegard. Yeah.
Well, that's amazing, Kevin. Your diet sounds a lot more healthy than mine, though we are in Lent at the time of recording this, so maybe we're getting close to it.
Well, if you want, I mean, Ina would be very happy to send all of the crazy ideas in our modern ideology, at least, of Saint Hildegard. You may regret it, but I'll take some of the examples and send it to you after the show. I may have to do an entire show on the diet of Saint Hildegard, just so other people can share a little bit in my sacrifice.
I hope that my wife Christina never hears that show. That's all good. Being healthy is good, and penance is always a good thing. And that's coming from someone who does not like mortifying their sense of taste.
Amen to that. Amen to that. Well, that's a good way to start into the Renaissance era, I think. Do you have any more comments on the 9th to 12th century of music?
I think we can definitely move on to the Renaissance era. So the 12th to 17th the 12th to 17th century, approximately. So the Renaissance era is where people start to go back to paganism and humanism. And I want to put an emphasis on start. They start to go back. Music starts to get more secular and man-focused. However, there was still a lot of spiritual / sacred music. Some beautiful music from this era. Now, we do start to hear the music start to sound more interesting. And by more interesting, I mean it's becoming more enjoyable for humans to listen to. Now, before I get into the effects based on my observations, Kevin, did you have any comments on this?
Yeah, I think I'm going to get into a little bit more when we listen to some of the clips, because I have a very specific comment about it. But I think you do see the polyphonic music really coming to the center. The different voices coming in and out, the different different voices taking over the melody, and the melody kind of going in and out of each, usually 4 parts, sometimes 8, 16 parts. I mean, some very intricate pieces of music. And obviously this is only talking about the choral or the only voice portions, because that's more of what I know. I know much more as a choir singer. I know much more about Palestrina and Vittoria than I do about Mozart. So hopefully you I think you're more the expert on the classical side of things. But I do think that this was, as you say, a very interesting time that it started to get much more complex, but it was still very beautiful in general.
Absolutely. And I would argue even a lot more simple than what music starts to get into. But yeah, it starts to get that man-focused thing going on. So as for the effects of the music of this era on people, again, I'm talking about how it might affect the listener. I'm going to do the caveat again. This is based on my observations and acknowledging that there are many different pieces of music from any era, but just as a general rule. So it's more engaging. I think that listeners will find this music a bit more engaging than they would from music with the medieval era. We see the same thing, I think, from the medieval era where there is peacefulness and stability. Again, I would say that this music does not affect emotions, or if so, quite minimally.
Right, exactly. So you're not sitting there listening to Palestrina and bumping your head or feeling too particularly sad. I think it is still a music that you definitely hear and think it as being godly. Now, the classical music, again, you have to speak to more about that, but I think that the choral music, again, you can tell that it was written for the purpose of God. But as you say, and I think very well, that it is becoming more about also entertaining men and not just about singing for God.
Absolutely. And how can we make this for God? But also do it in such a way that people enjoy it more as well. And I want to also put out there that, like Kevin said at the beginning of this show, I've obviously done some research. Kevin's done some research. We have all this this knowledge, I guess, just from living. However, I'd also like to put it out there to any listeners who think that they know more about a particular aspect to even contact me. I'm happy, Kevin, for you to put my email address on the show notes and to say, hey, Matt, this actually, I think you were off the mark a little bit here, and here's why. Always love to see that kind of stuff. So please, please do feel free. If any of the listeners think they know more about a particular aspect, I'll be very interested to hear what you have to say and the evidence you have to back that up.
For sure. And I know in a future show, I want to have on my good friend, Paolo, who is a violinist and who is obviously a very learned musician. And I'd be very curious to hear his take on a lot of this music stuff as well. So who knows, he could have a totally different take than you and I have. I don't honestly know, but that's the beauty of these things. This is just our opinion, as you say. And if anyone else knows better, please tell us. Paolo, if you're listening to this, then go ahead and send me a message and we'll set up a show to talk about more detail and about your opinion as well, which I hope to do in the future. So I guess let's go ahead and jump into some of the samples from the Renaissance era.
Absolutely. So the first one is by a composer, and I'm going to butcher this pronunciation, I'm sure, but Claude Dudamel. Yeah, Claude Dudamel? I don't know, but we'll get into it.
No idea.
So I don't know about you, Kevin, but when I listen to that, for me, I'm still hearing that peacefulness, and I'm still hearing how it's stable. I'm still hearing that godliness, if you will, but I'm definitely starting to hear a bit more flavor. What would you say?
For sure. You had a couple of notes where you have not the dissonance, but you have the other voices kind of peaking up over the others and kind of bringing out a little more of that. Yeah, flavor, exactly as you say, a little more oomph to it, but it is still kind of a melody with a 4-part chord, I guess. I don't know how else to say that, but you have different voices coming in, but singing the same words at the same time, which makes it still a little more simple than what we're going to get into even with the next clip, which is much more of the polyphonic in and out with different melodies coming in and taking over, which is more of what I really love and appreciate. Again, as a singer, it's much more interesting to me, I think, typically as a singer, but there are some very, very beautiful hymns as the one we just listened to sing and to listen to. As you say, it is still very godly.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's very, you can hear how it is becoming a bit more engaging for the human ear, I would say. Starting, obviously nothing close to where music goes, but we can start to hear it, especially when we compare it to the music excerpts that we played for the medieval era.
For sure. All right, what's next?
We'll get into the next one, and this is Palestrina, an excerpt from Palestrina.
My favorite. Yeah, I even do get a little bit of shivers or goosebumps when I listen to Palestrina. I think he is my favorite composer of all time. He has so many different masses and hymns that are, I think, the most beautiful pieces of music ever written, besides maybe the Solemn Salve Regina, the chant, the Solemn Salve Regina, the Gregorian chant, which is, I think, again, divinely inspired in my opinion. But I think for music written by men, I think Palestrina to me is just the apex of beauty. And you just hear the different voices coming in and out and taking over melody. And you just have this perfect wave of sound with Palestrina. I love it. I could listen to Palestrina all day long.
Well, that's awesome. I have to admit, Kevin, I wasn't expecting, I've probably come in here with a bit of a dry analysis mentality, but I really love to hear the enthusiasm with it. And I think to me, that piece sounded nicer than that excerpt, I should say, sounded nicer than the excerpt beforehand. And I would say that I think it sounded a bit more like godly, I guess. Like it was a bit closer to the medieval era than the previous one. But we can still hear that there is that clear difference where it's getting a little bit more complex, a little bit nicer to the human ear.
Well, as you say, yeah, exactly. I think it was similar kind of to the St. Hildegard piece where you have these kind of sharp up and downs, the dropping of an octave and all these different intricate pieces. And a really interesting piece of history, which I'm not sure this is confirmed, but it's much reported in the time of Palestrina, who I believed died in, 1580, 1590. And during his lifetime, he was very good friends with St. Philip Neri, by the way, a great saint who I recommend anyone wants to learn about St. Philip Neri. My brother, who's a priest, took his name when he became a novice in the CMRI. Great saint. And Palestrina. At the time, he's not a saint, but he died in the arms of St. Philip Neri. So in good, he was in good company when he died. But anyway, during his lifetime, the Pope of the time had a real issue, and the church in general had an issue with the polyphonic music that was coming out, because they believed that it actually it was becoming too human. It was taking away from God and becoming more of trying to bring attention to the choir or trying to bring attention to the composer or whatnot. It was getting a little bit too much. And the saying goes that Palestrina wrote a polyphonic mass for the Pope, which eventually he wrote it, he submitted it to the church, to the Pope, and this council and the Pope decided that due to this, polyphonic music would remain and would be allowed to be sung in the churches. And I think that the church did make it a little more, they regulated it a little more and tried to push it down a bit to make it so that it wasn't too humanistic. But it's really interesting that I think you could see already that it was already devolving and into this much more human way, even though it was still beautiful. I mean, Palestrina is so beautiful to me, but he had to save that form of music, which I think is really telling.
Yeah, that's a great story, Kevin.
All right, what have we got next? So after Palestrina, oh boy, we've got an English one. This is where I start to be a little less happy about things.
Well, we have to be diverse, Kevin. So we'll get into that's a joke, by the way, for listeners. But we'll get into Thomas Campion. All right. So when I hear that, I'm still hearing peacefulness. I'm still hearing stability, but I'm really starting to hear some of that humanism coming out. In fact, when I listen to that, it almost reminds me a bit of Protestantism. And obviously that's in hindsight. But what are your thoughts?
That's absolutely right. I didn't look into Thomas Campion, but I think he was around the time of King Henry VIII, or maybe a little after. Please correct me if I'm wrong, anyone who's listening, but that's what I recognize his name from. And it makes sense because the lyrics are obviously in English, which I am really strongly against. And I've sung a few, I guess I should say I've sung many English hymns in church, and I think about 1% of them I've actually liked or enjoyed. And I think there's a reason for it. I think that Latin is the language of the church, and I think it's the language of God in a way because it's the language of the church. And so I think we instinctively know that. We hear that. When you hear Latin sung, you know that this is a song for God. When you hear English sung, I don't think it's quite so easy to say that. I think you hear the English and you can think, wait, okay, who are they singing for? Are they singing to the king? Or are they singing about God? And I think it's not always that simple. And I think many of these songs, which I think we'll have a few more coming up, which are sung in English, I think it becomes really less sure of who they are singing to and much, much more humanistic. So as soon as I hear English, it just immediately turns me off.
That's a great point. Yeah, absolutely. That Latin, as soon as you hear Latin in something, you're going to assume it's Catholic.
Right, because it's this dead language that is really only used ecclesiastically anymore. And so when you hear it, you know that it's saved for that. It's that's the intention of the whole thing. And I think that, to me, that's where it should stay. I don't think, I mean, I guess the vernacular has its place in hymns. I mean, here in Germany, they almost only sing German hymns, which there's some very nice hymns, and the Germans wrote some very nice stuff. But in my opinion, that should be more for Christmas carols or something that you sing outside or something you sing with your family. I think if you sing it in the church, especially if you sing it during the Mass, it should absolutely only be in Latin. Just my opinion.
I think it's definitely something worth mentioning. Obviously, listening, if you enjoy such a piece of music, it's good to listen to. It's worlds better than modern music. But I think because we have that historical hindsight behind us, we know what Protestantism has done. We know how huge it has become, and we probably start to associate things that maybe back in the time, I don't know actually if Thomas Campion was a Protestant. He well could have been. I actually have no idea. I'm just looking at the music here. But let's just say theoretically that there was a Catholic piece of music there that was in English. Because Protestantism took away the Latin, I think they took away the Latin anyway, you start to sort of get a bit of the feeling of it being tainted. So there's always that thing. But yeah, definitely some good points there. I think it's also good to encourage listeners that, you know, if you enjoy this song, even if it's in English, this is good music to listen to. Worlds better than modern music. And we'll get into that later, but just thought it's something that might be nice to point out as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. When I say I'm really nitpicking when I'm saying I don't like English hymns. Obviously, they're still hymns and they're meant for God. I mean, and you'll see plenty of church books all over the world with your own language and songs that you'll sing, and that's fine. I'm just purely my opinion, purely nitpicking and saying, yeah, you can tell that it starts to sink farther and farther into more of an entertainment is a little too harsh, but more of pleasing men and not just pleasing God. And I guess that brings us again farther into the Baroque era.
Yes, the 16th to 18th century, approximately. So the Baroque period is where more musical styles are born, and music starts to get more interesting again. New forms and techniques come to light. And I'm going to be honest here. I think this period has some really cool music. Vivaldi, Bach, and Handel were a part of this period. However, music is starting to get more secularized and less focused on God. Seeing a bit of a trend here, aren't we, Kevin?
Down it goes.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And before we get on to the effects, which I like to talk about, which is obviously just my observations, Kevin, did you have anything else that you wanted to add on the Baroque era at this time?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a lot to add because I guess this era I think primarily as classical rather than choral. So the classical music I just don't know as well. I can tell you I do really enjoy Vivaldi. I do enjoy Mozart, Bach. Some things I really like, some things I don't as much. Handel the same. I really like some pieces of Handel. Other pieces I don't like the Alleluia chorus. I really enjoy, even though it's in English. But some of the other parts of the Messiah from Handel, I really just can't get through. It's a little too operatic for me, and it's not my style. Again, maybe it's yours, maybe it's other people's. Just personally speaking, for me, it starts to go downhill in terms of choral music. So it's simply sung music rather than classical. But you can speak much better to the classical strings and whatnot.
Yeah, that's a good point you mentioned. I have to say personally that I'm not a fan of a lot of classical singing. Opera, no thank you. Some really good pieces that are just instruments, I love it. Like I would, and this is just me personally, and I'm actually very picky. Like there's a lot of people don't realize this, but there is so much classical music. When I say classical, I'm referring to Baroque as well. There's actually so much music out there. And the funny thing is that new versions are getting recorded all the time. There's such a classical music movement that it's not like you listen to some really low quality recording nowadays. There's stuff getting released every day, and you get some really good music that's even engineered really well as well. But I would say that with this kind of music, which I quite enjoy, yeah, I agree. I'm not a fan of the vocals as much, but some of the instrumentals, in my opinion, they are more human. Don't get me wrong; they're much more focused on pleasing man. However, I think some of it is really, really cool stuff. Well, again,
absolutely.
A lot better than modern music. Yeah,
for sure. I mean, you listen to. I mean, Vivaldi is a good one. Again, I really enjoy Vivaldi, and it really. It does something to my mood. And they say that it's actually good for you to listen to Vivaldi and Mozart when you have babies in the womb and young babies. They say, I don't know if this is true, but they say that it helps their mental faculties. They say it's good for studying, it's good for learning, it's good for even, I guess, meditation, even though I think meditation should be done silently. But anyway, it is music that still uplifts your mind. But this is an interesting point, and I don't know if you feel the same way, but I think you start to see that it uplifts your mind and your heart, but not necessarily your soul. And I don't know if that's maybe the difference. Maybe I'm just kind of making that up on the spot, but I think that maybe that's kind of where we start to see the degrading of it in terms of godliness, but not necessarily in terms of its beauty, I suppose.
I think that's a very good point. And I would agree that it is, intellectually uplifting as well. It obviously, we'll get into the excerpts soon to talk about that, but we'll start to hear how it is still intellectually uplifting, I would say, lifting the heart as well. But we will start to hear how it just doesn't have the same spiritual element as the previous eras did have. And one thing I think is good to note is that not everything you listen to has to be spiritual in and of itself. People have to have leisure. And people people who usually aren't saints, I should say, generally need a bit of stuff that's just enjoyable in and of itself. And I guess the term they would use would be indifferent. That is, it's not evil, but it's not in and of itself really spiritually uplifting either. But what you want to do is when you're doing that stuff, you don't want to be doing something that you are telling yourself is indifferent when it's actually bad for you. And I would say that this kind of music is probably the kind of thing that would be indifferent, but also good on a physical way, a mental way, because it does really speak to one's intellect.
Exactly. Yeah. And as you say, I mean, people have every right to enjoyment. I mean, the church is pretty clear about it being okay to drink wine, to drink beer. And obviously it's all in moderation, of course. I mean, this is in terms of everything we do in life is it has to be moderated. But of course, yeah, you can listen to this just for sheer enjoyment. And I'm sure many people do. All we're saying is just you can see that the downtrend of it being intended for God and uplifting the soul to now being just to uplift the mind and heart, which is okay, but it's obviously a lower form of music. So well, let's listen to a few of these and see what everyone else thinks. What's first?
Absolutely. As you said, we're starting to see a downward spiral. I might just quickly talk about the effects just really quick, just the music on people. Again, based on my observations, acknowledging there are many different pieces of music, good old caveat. But I think we see here peacefulness, stability, intellectually stimulating now, keeping the listener more engaged in the previous eras. I would say affects emotions slightly, and this is just a general rule, but not much. So the first example we get into is by Arcangelo Corelli. So with that one, we start to hear that it's definitely getting more interesting. It's starting to sound more human focused, but some of the stuff I would say sounds really, really cool. And it's more interesting, but just not the same spiritual feeling, if you will, the spiritual vibe.
Well, I think you hear the brilliance of the composers too. I think you hear many of these pieces are really kind of a genius. I mean, and again, I think a lot of it is mathematical. I mean, for music to fit together, you really have to add it together. It really is. It's a very mathematical form, as far as I know. Again, I've never done it, but when you look at notes, you're counting. How many notes fit in this bar and how many fit there, and how does this fit with this? And it's a very almost scientific way of actually creating something. I think that when you listen to that, you don't always think about that. You think, this is beautiful and it's very nice and it's almost, you think of it as being creative, but it's not necessarily creative. It is actually more of a mathematical science, as far as I know. As far as I can understand it, there's a reason why it sounds good. It's because it's very perfectly put together.
Absolutely. And there are a lot of rules as a musical system. One thing is, though, I would also say is it's kind of taking the science, that mathematics, using those rules, but also applying that, I guess, artisticness to it. I don't even know if that's a word, but it's like a really good mix of having the mathematics with quality. It's really qualitative. And we do actually start to see a bit later in history, in the 20th century, a form of music that we'll touch on slightly in this episode, but not too much. But they start to get too mathematical and they start to use like numbers instead of notes. I'm not going to get into all the detail, but what I will say is the music sounds, as a general rule, terrible. But they also, when they're using numbers, are using a different music system than the traditional music system. So what I like about this is how it has a good balance. It's not like all about just the numbers, but it's let's take that science of the numbers and also apply that qualitative beauty to it.
Nice. Yep. Good. Okay, what's next?
We have a Vivaldi piece. When I listen to that, I think that sounds pretty cool. I start to hear, I like the part sort of in the middle where it starts to go off a little bit. It starts to go a bit away from home, we can hear, and it's building that tension. Obviously not as much as you're going to hear in some modern film music, but in that beautiful way, it's building that sort of tension in a good way, then it comes right back. You can also hear the dynamics, how suddenly there's instruments playing quite loud and soft and then back to loud. But we can definitely hear how it's getting more man focused, but I think there's a lot to appreciate in that excerpt we just listened to.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's definitely more emotional. I think it brings you kind of into this anticipation and kind of, but it's also, as you say, it's also still beautiful. I think that's where they get away with it. That I think it is much more emotional, much more human, but it is beautiful. That there's still something to it that is not off-putting. It arouses different emotions, but not bad ones, I think. And I think that makes, to me, again, for Vivaldi, I enjoy listening to it, especially if you listen to it live. I went to see Paolo again live doing Vivaldi, and there's just something that it's amazingly, I don't know, touching. I don't want to say touching, but it's just really inspiring. It brings you to a different place mentally, which I think, again, gets it so he gets away with a little bit of more of the emotion.
Yeah, that's it. I have to say, like, I can definitely hear some of the emotion there when I listen to it. And I guess this is where you do get to have that subjective sort of how music's going to affect some people differently. Even though it's quite sort of happy, I would say, and it has those strings, of course, strings being violins, those kind of instruments. They're kind of renowned, for swaying people's emotions. Even then, in the composition, I can hear a bit of emotion, but I'm still hearing a lot of intellectually stimulating composition there. But you could definitely we can clearly hear that difference to previous eras. And that's just going to get much more emotional. Like if you're thinking of emotional classical style music, like this is just getting started.
All right, Matt, then what's next for us?
We have here a piece by Bach, commonly known as Jesu, Joy of Man's Desiring, but this one's also going to have some vocals to it.
Yeah, that is, again, it's very interesting. And I have to say that actually is a little personally effective for me, because that was sung at my wedding right before my wife walked in. So there's a story behind that too, is because it was supposed to be a violin solo, but it was a really hot day and the violin melted, or part of it melted, so it couldn't be played. And so the fortunate thing is that the violinist is also a very good tenor, and my brother as well. So they both sang this song together. So I think, again, it's a very beautiful song, personally touching for me. I do have to say, though, listening this time, it really makes me feel, again, that it's beautiful. I like it, but it doesn't immediately make me think of God. So I think you start to see, again, I like it. I could listen to it all the time. Nothing wrong with it, but it's not godly. That's the one point I would make.
I agree. That's a great story, by the way. That's actually really interesting. Good agility from that violinist / tenor. And then, did you say your brother, he got up to join as well?
Yeah, exactly. So, right. So it was the last second thing. Obviously, the violinist comes up, and he's one of my German friends, good German friends. And he comes up to me about 20 minutes before the wedding, or maybe an hour before the wedding. He's like, "Kevin, I got some terrible news." And he was just crushed. And he's like, "Yeah, the violin melted on the drive over. So I can't play the violin." And I'm just sitting there like, okay, whatever, I'm about to get married. I didn't really care at the time. And he just kind of left. He's like, yeah, we'll figure it out. And then I heard them a couple minutes later singing up in the choir loft. So again, like, as you say, very good way to adapt and figure it out on the fly. But it's beautiful. I've got recordings of it somewhere. They did an amazing job. I mean, really beautiful. We had this huge church at our wedding on the Lake of Constance in the middle of the very southern part of Germany. And this huge cathedral-like church that's just the most beautiful church I've ever seen. And we were really fortunate to be able to be married there. And perfect acoustics and just, I mean, really one of the greatest days of my life, not just because I was married, which was obviously the best ever, but also because it was truly a beautiful ceremony and choir.
That's awesome. That's a great story. I'd love to hear that recording if you could ever find it.
I'll look for it. I've seen it recently, so I'll send it over to you.
That'd be cool. As for this particular piece as well, I agree. When I listen to it, I don't hear it being godly. I hear it a little bit being godly, but I almost hear of it as an attempt rather than successful, like with the Gregorian chant. However, musically, I have to say, I love this piece. There are some really good, even just piano versions out there. And this piece is really cool. And it's for me, it's like, I'm not really saying, I don't really find it touching. I guess to a degree it is actually, I would say, yeah, maybe it is a bit touching, but even musically, how all of it works so well together. And even how, I don't know if it's a French horn, but there's some brass instrument sort of doing that solo. And you can hear one part where it plays these notes that sound a little bit interesting. I don't know if it's done a key change. Bach, it's brilliant. He did some really cool things. Musically, I think some people who study music sometimes don't know why he did what he did, but it always sounds really good. Yeah, I think there's a lot to appreciate in that. And when I say that, I'm more referring to from an intellectual point of view, and I'm looking at more of a natural point of view rather than a spiritual point of view.
Yeah, exactly. And as you say, some interesting notes. I think there's actually like dissonance. There are notes that are, like you say, they're against what you naturally are inclined to be ready for. When you're listening to music, you naturally understand what should come next. And that's what a lot of music does, especially the older music. But this music is not intuitive. There are a couple notes, especially at times, where it's like, whoa, but it's beautiful. And I think that's really, like you say, it's really unique, at least to this song, maybe to Bach. I don't know Bach very well, but to this song for sure. And I think you see that much more as we progress into further centuries, that it becomes more and more dissonant. And when we get to it, I really want to talk about the modern choral music, the modern music written for sacred, for the church. I mean, some of it's for the false church, unfortunately, but even in the 20th century, it was written for the true Catholic Church. And you really started to hear much more of that dissonance, which was not as beautiful as Bach was able to do it as in this piece.
Very interesting. And one thing as well I would add just quickly is that even when we hear those notes that you don't expect, a lot of the time, these composers weren't just chucking them in randomly. And I think it's really important to mention that from this era, there was still a science behind it. And I don't want to get too nerdy with this. However, composers can do things like change a key and change this note and do a chord that's out of key from the original, but bring it back. They don't just do it randomly. There is a science behind it, and it is part of the traditional music rules, but it's making it more interesting. And again, what's the reasoning for that? I would say to make it more interesting for humans.
Well, and I think that I wanted to bring this up at some point, and I could be totally off base on this, but I've been thinking about this show for a while, and it came to me that I thought Gregorian chant, in my opinion, is like 2 + 2 = 4. It's very simple, it's obvious, and it is just how it is. It's the truth. And then you start to get into the polyphonic, and it's more like 3 times the square root of 9 equals whatever that is, and so it gets more complicated, but it's still the truth. And I think, in my opinion, you start to get into this more dissonant area, not Bach, but I guess like with jazz, which I think is really truly dissonant and things that are, as you say, random. In my ears, I hear just random notes being played. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's what I hear. And so like jazz to me is like 2 + octopus = cracker. That there's no, it's not even, they don't even try anymore. There's no mathematics. It's just like, we're just going to throw it out there, kind of like modern art, and you can call it beautiful or not. And I think that you see again how it devolves from being simple math to being something that is not even mathematical whatsoever.
Absolutely. And I think with jazz, I'm not an expert on it, but I think jazz musicians are generally specialized in improvising. I don't think that's the kind of thing that's going to encourage musical rule keeping, so to speak.
Exactly. It's just whatever they feel at the time to do. And maybe people are interested by that. I'm not saying it's evil, but just again, in my opinion, when you go away from the actual mathematical beauty of it, it's not no more objectively beautiful. You can find it beautiful, I guess, yourself, but it's not objectively beautiful as things are that have symmetry and that have, actual equations, I suppose.
Absolutely. And just really quickly, I want to also say that some people might say jazz musicians, Matt, you said that they were trained and they're more there for improvising. Well, classical musicians were as well. And that's absolutely true. Like, some of these classical composers were absolutely phenomenal on an instrument or instruments. However, they were trained in that composition as well. Whereas, I could be wrong here, happy to be proven wrong. My understanding is that the jazz music behind it, there is a lot of theory and some really complex theory, arguably some theory that I think is a little bit dumb. But I don't really see the theory of staying within these rules and making beautiful working music as much of a focus as I think it was back in the eras that we are discussing, that we are up to at the moment in this show.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that we're going to continue on to that in a second episode. We've run pretty long here, which I thought might be the case. So I think we're going to end the episode here. We're going to end it after speaking about Bach and after speaking about Palestrina and Vivaldi and all these beautiful composers. And we're going to end it in the Baroque era, which I think was still kind of, now it wasn't the climax of it, but it was coming down slowly. It was not a quick, descent from the beautiful nature of music as it was in the 9th and 12th centuries. In our next show, we're going to talk about the classical era. I am a newbie, so I always call everything classical music, but I think the actual classical era was from the 18th to the 19th century. We will also, of course, talk about modern music and actually the Romantic era from the 19th to the 20th century, and then the modern music as we know it today. We'll talk about that in episode 2, and then we'll actually go on to an episode 3 where we'll talk much more about the effects of modern music and how we can resist them and try to find something that is actually beneficial for us. So Matthew, thanks so much for being here for episode 1, and I will see you again for episode 2 coming up in the next few days.
Thanks very much, Kevin. It was great. I look forward to the second episode.
You've been listening to the Catholic Family Podcast. If you enjoyed this show, please share it with your friends and family. You can support the production on Patreon and PayPal, and you can reach Kevin at kevin89davis@gmail.com. Ad Maiorem Dei Gloriam. All for the greater glory of God.